So they just assumed that, oh, well, all of that was ironed out. And so I don't even have to go back to the first millennium. I can just look at whatever Aquinas said because he got it right. Oh, really? So when he relies on against the errors of the Greeks, how useful is that when it's full of forgeries? So all of that wisdom of Aquinas, how come it didn't help him to see that this was a document full of forgeries? He's your angelic doctor. The angels didn't whisper in his ear, "Psst, that document is a bunch of forgeries." I mean, I see pictures in Roman Catholic churches of Thomas Aquinas with a book and a pen and angels whispering into his ear, but the angels couldn't tell him. He's relying on a book full of forgeries.
Yeah, that's what we've seen with George and the library of forgeries. Most of what Aquinas quotes from church fathers, they're forgeries. We've had a good laugh today. We found one where Aquinas quotes St. John Chrysostom, who died who was a 5th century father. Yeah. St. John Chrysostom sending and talking to an emissary of the Bulgars will appear for several centuries later, and like the time traveling Bulgars probably. And like, how did they notice this? And
they had a DeLorean. They knew Doc Brown, Marty, right? So they got in the DeLorean with Marty McFly, and they flew back and talked to John Chrysostom, and then they went back to their century.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't make a good knife with bad iron, and that's a big problem. Aquinas relies on forgeries. He relies on philosophical systems that are foreign to Christian thinking, and you can justify anything you want. So now you have this papacy in this West that try to justify itself against the East, as the Franks did. So they're playing the part that the Franks did, and they're using scholasticism. They're using all these new systems, and they're moving away. And that's why, if you talk to people from the Roman Catholic Church, they will defend probably Renaissance aesthetics, they will defend scholastic thinking, and they will defend Vatican I ultramontanism. But early church really rarely. They would sometimes find a quote from a pope, or someone talking about the pope in good terms, which non sequitur means that he's the emperor of the universe, and that's a big problem. And I wanted to come back on the idea of royalty of the kingdom, of royal sainthood, which we established is traditional. That's the moment where you start to see less and less saintly kings, because the pope needs to erode the power of the king, the power of the emperor. You have people who start saying, "Oh, the councils weren't really called by the emperors; they were called by the pope mostly." Even if he didn't attend, even when he wasn't invited, like in the Second Council of Constantinople, you have people like Baronius using.
he called it, but he wasn't invited.
Yeah, not even legates came to the Second Council in Constantinople. So eroding this idea, eroding the Fifth Council where the Pope was actually defrocked and then reinstated, eroding the Sixth Council because Honorius was excommunicated for heresy, all of these things, and eroding the power of the kings. So we've come to this realization talking to many French monarchists, and at some point people were asking themselves, like, we're Catholic because it's a default religion in France, and what's happening when the Pope doesn't agree? And that's what happened all the time. The popes fought against this idea of the king being the representative of the people. They started to establish what's called the interdict, ecclesiastical interdiction, meaning that no sacrament will be valid in the entire country for decades at times. That's what happened in France for quite a while. There's a moment where you see saints, like royal sainthood dwindling. In France, for example, there's only one king that's a saint. It's Louis IX, Saint Louis, because he made a crusade, and he wasn't really a saint for his personal piety. He was a saint for his ability to be the sword of the Pope. And that's absolutely not what we see in early history. For example, in France,
that's a great point. That's a great point.
You see kings that embody their people and then go to monastery. And for example, we have, I think 2 days ago, we celebrated the synod of all the Russian monarchs who were sainted. There were 160, because all of these little principalities, they had these people who went to monastery and tried to be pious and stuff like this. And now it's completely disappearing. you have probably King Kazimierz Jagiellon in Poland, but this idea of royal sainthood dwindles, this idea of linked to the people dwindles, and now the Pope.
Yes, and so here we go. If we screw up the doctrine of the symphonia, that's correct, which is what happens at this time period that we're looking at. Not only do we get the theology all messed up, we get the theology of the state messed up, and then we begin to lose the notion of the sanctity of the state, that the state has a role as a diakonos, minister of God. And so then it becomes a political thing, like we're talking about with, an arm of the Crusades. That's not the point of the state. But the Orthodox tradition continues this notion of the role of the state. Loosely, it's there in the West, but it's kind of confused because they don't really have the symphonia view, because eventually the rise of the papacy, the Pope becomes both. He becomes the head of church and state. But it's not that way in the East, because the East is the continuation of the Byzantine idea, obviously, clearly, right? Even in the symbology of the double-headed eagle, right? That's lost. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire continues that symbology, but the whole idea of it's gone because the papacy becomes, again, the head of church and state. So what happens is that you can see the natural progression of, well, if you mess up the relationship of church and state and symphonia, then what's eventually going to happen is you're going to lose the idea of a Christian state or nation. And shocker, that's what happens in the West. Both the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches of the West, even though initially, let's say at the time of the Reformation, both of those churches had a conception of a Christian state. Even the German princes allied with Luther, and even to a degree Calvin, had a conception of some kind of Christian notion of the state. However, a few centuries down the road, when all this Western theology degenerates on both sides, the Roman Catholic and the Protestant, shocker, secular state. In the whole West, secular state. Total loss of the notion of the sacramental idea of the state.
Exactly. So, first of all, in the first place, it justifies, political Protestantism. People want to distantiate themselves from the Holy Roman Emperor. People want to distantiate themselves from the papacy. People want to, dismantle those monasteries. Political Protestantism is motivated because if you're not the ally of the Pope will ruin your state. The Pope will damn your population, your people that you're supposed to tend for. The Pope will, control your clergy, control your administration. Of course, you have people who rebel against this, even under persecution, probably overreach of the state in Russia during the reforms of Peter the Great.
Sure,
the church didn't do this, and that's where political Protestantism comes in. And how do we respond to political Protestantism? With more papal supremacy, with more and more papal supremacy, with persecution of the Protestant.
Exactly right.
It ends up with Vatican I, and Vatican I says, I'm the king of the universe. I have my ordinary magisterium extends to all Christians on matters of discipline, on matters of stuff, and if you don't follow it, you're losing faith and salvation. This is Vatican I, Pastor Aetonis. And of course, if you're a head of state and you see this, you're going to secularize. It took only 35 years for France, which is a country that since its inception had historically a clergy-dominated administration. Even under Napoleon reinstated many clergymen into the institution, even right after his revolution. It took only 35 years from Vatican I to the total law of secularization of the state in France. It's a direct consequence. And you see it everywhere. So yes, this is an overreach. This is a destruction of the balance that you're supposed to see between church and state. I'm not saying that Russia is perfect. It's a web used from the Tsars as well. But people lost this notion. And people lost this notion of the king, of the head of state as a representative. People lost this notion of royal sainthood. There are very few royal saints late in the Catholic era. Of course, you have women royal saints because, this idea of woman worship and very effeminate worship and
the histrionics,
ideas of emotional worship. stuff about femininity, submission to the Pope and the Church and stuff like this. So yeah, you lose this idea of, also virility. You lose this idea of virility. You lose this idea of sainthood, and this has been devastating for the West. I'm not saying that the East is doing well, but you can still see it today politically through what kind of charisma people try to embody in the political spheres in the East, probably.
Okay, so what's next? Is there more? Do you want to talk about one thing I wanted to throw in that I looked back on my old notes was I didn't remember this. So apparently in 1299, Pope Boniface VIII issued a encyclical Detestande Veritatis, which excommunicated any of the princes for heart worship, body division, or the kinds of practices that the Franks were known for doing. So that's a vindication of the fact that this really was going on. Now, I know we're not here to talk today about heart worship, but I went back and I was reading through my notes on the Frankish period and the rise of the Sacred Heart practice and devotion from heart worship and blood relics, blood piety, which is all kind of superstitious type stuff. And this relates to many of the streams that Snek and I have done in the past where we talked about these superstitious devotions and weird practices. They still continue and into the period when the Jesuits start, utilizing it for so-called anti-Protestant counter-Reformation usages. But what this suggests that's interesting that I'd forgotten is that in Orthodox conception, the body is holy. So we have the notion, of not embalming, of not doing cremation, and there's this problem even in how to view the body between the papacy that was even still adhering to the older tradition because Boniface VIII is rejecting this, and then Clement V is installed, who is one of the relatives of, because so Philip the Fair kidnaps Boniface VIII, beats him up, and then Clement V is, after a brief period, is installed, Avignon papacy, and then he okays heart burial and heart worship. So you have another change. It basically says to the court, yes, if you want to do these practices, you can. So again, we see that putting people into the office of the papacy for political power and motivation is clearly what's going on here. And that shows.
The Avignon papacy, that's the whole point. The Avignon papacy is basically what Pepin tried to do with the papal state. It's okay. So the Holy Roman Empire was getting destroyed from within because of its political institution, and it's linked with a foreign papacy. So basically, the Avignon papacy was a French, the Kingdom of France, which separated. Try to control the papacy, and of course it's politically motivated. Philippe le Bel, Philippe the Fair, apparently didn't really care about papal supremacy and so on. When he literally sent a commander to beat up the Pope and instituted this. So yes, that continued to be used for politically motivated use, and we see it until very late.